Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dark Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to help you fall asleep, and before you drift off, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from around the world. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. It started quietly, almost like a routine. Every morning, when I would open the door to get the mail, I would find a small package or a paper bag sitting on my doorstep. The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had left something there by accident. But as the days went by, it became clear that it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was intentionally leaving food on my doorstep, and it was happening every day. At first, the food seemed harmless enough. It was just simple things. Sandwiches, fruit, small portions of soup, and sometimes a bottle of juice or water. I wasn't sure what to do with it. The idea of receiving food from a stranger made me uneasy. I didn't know who this person was or why they were doing this, but I couldn't find anything wrong with the food. There were no signs of tampering, no strange smells, or discoloration. The food looked fresh, well prepared, and even appetizing, which only made the situation more confusing. Each meal came with a note attached. The notes were simple, just a few words written on a small piece of paper, but the handwriting caught my attention. It was neat and deliberate, but unfamiliar. It looked like someone had put effort into it, but I couldn't place the handwriting. I had no idea who might be leaving these notes for me, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it became. There were no return addresses, no signatures, nothing to identify the sender, just the food and the note. The first note I received said, "I hope this helps. You're not alone." It felt like a strange mix of kindness and something I couldn't understand. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a kind gesture from a neighbor, someone who had noticed I seemed to be going through a tough time and wanted to offer some support. Maybe they had seen how often I was home alone and thought I could use a little help. But as the days passed, the mystery deepened. The food kept appearing, right on schedule, and the notes kept coming. The messages were always short and cryptic, yet oddly comforting in a strange way. One note said, "Take care of yourself." Another said, "Don't forget to rest." And then there was one that simply said, "You matter." Each note left me with more questions. Why was this person doing this? Why me? What did they mean by, "You're not alone"? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these gestures than just kindness. The whole situation felt like it was leading somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. I started to leave my house at odd times, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person leaving the food. I wanted to confront them, to ask why they were doing this, to see if I could figure out who it was. But no matter when I went to the door, the food was always already there. It was always left early in the morning, just before I woke up. I began to obsess over finding out who was behind this. I set up a small camera near the door, hoping to capture some footage of the mysterious food giver. But when I checked the recordings, there was nothing. The camera would capture me going to the door, but no one would ever appear in the footage. It was as if the person was slipping in and out of the shadows without leaving a trace. Then one evening, after weeks of this strange routine, the note that came with the food was different. It was longer than usual and read, "I know what you're afraid of. Don't worry. Everything is going to be okay. Just trust me." The words sent a chill through me. How did this person know what I was afraid of? I had never mentioned my fears to anyone, at least not in a way that would be obvious to a stranger. The note felt invasive, as if the person was watching me and knew more about me than I was comfortable with. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the note. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who was this person? Why were they leaving food on my doorstep? What did they want from me? I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. There wasn't any obvious threat. The food was always safe, and the notes, though cryptic, weren't overtly threatening. They were just strange, but the handwriting was bothering me. It looked familiar, but I couldn't figure out where I had seen it before. The next morning, there was another note, but this time it was different. Instead of just a few words, it was a small paragraph. It read, "I know you're scared. You should be. But you can't ignore what's happening. You're going to need help soon. I'll be here when you do. Trust me." I stood on my doorstep, the note clutched in my hand, trying to make sense of it all. The feeling of unease that had been growing in my chest for weeks now intensified. Someone knew something about me. Someone was watching me, and they were waiting for the right moment to reveal something. But what? As the days went on, I found myself becoming more and more paranoid. I checked the door multiple times a day to see if there was any sign of the person leaving the food. I checked the windows, the locks, and the shadows in the corners of the house, hoping for some sign of who was behind it all. But nothing ever came. The food kept appearing, always fresh, always well packed, and the notes kept coming, always more cryptic than the last. Then, one morning, the food wasn't there. The door was empty. No note, no sandwich, no fruit, no drink. It felt wrong, like something had shifted. For a moment, I stood there staring at the doorstep, waiting for the familiar package to appear. But it didn't. I felt an odd sense of loss, mixed with a strange sense of relief. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that something else was coming. The silence, after all those days of routine, felt ominous. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to go about my daily life, trying to act normal. But the absence of the food and the notes left a disturbing gap. I wondered if whoever had been leaving the food had simply given up, or if something else was happening behind the scenes. I thought about trying to reach out to my neighbors to see if anyone knew anything, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure what to say. What if they hadn't noticed anything? What if the person was someone close to me, someone I knew but couldn't identify? Then, just when I was starting to believe that the strange ritual had come to an end, the food reappeared. But this time, it wasn't on the doorstep. It was sitting on my kitchen table when I arrived home from work. Along with the food, there was another note. The handwriting was still the same, but the message was different. It read, "I never left. I'm right here. You just haven't seen me yet." I stood in my kitchen, staring at the note, my hands shaking. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. Whoever was leaving these notes and food had been right under my nose the entire time. But who were they? Why were they doing this? And most importantly, why hadn't I seen them yet? Story 2. It all started quietly, almost without me noticing at first. The first night, I didn't think much of it. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the soft creak of the floorboards beneath me. It was a sound I was used to in an old house, floorboards that had settled over the years, worn and weathered by time. But this sound felt different. It wasn't just the house shifting. It felt like something, or someone, was quietly moving across the room. At first, I brushed it off. I thought it was just the house adjusting, as old houses do. But still, a small feeling of unease crept over me as I drifted back to sleep. The creaking continued in the following nights, always at the same time, just when everything outside had gone quiet and the house seemed to settle into its usual rhythm. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. The sound tugged at the edges of my awareness, and every night I would hear it more clearly. The floorboards in the hallway right outside my bedroom would creak, and then a slightly louder squeak near the door to the living room would follow. Each time I froze for a moment, listening intently. But no other sounds would follow. It was as if something or someone was trying to make their presence known, but then stopped when I wasn't looking. I couldn't explain it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe the wood expanding, or contracting with the change in temperature. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. One evening, after several nights of hearing the creaking, I decided to investigate. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to disturb the stillness of the house. I walked into the hallway, following the sounds I had been hearing. The creaks seemed to come from the area around the door to the living room, but when I reached the door, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there for a moment, listening closely, but the house was eerily silent. I opened the door to the living room, expecting to find the usual shadows cast by the streetlight outside, but everything appeared normal. There was no one there. I closed the door behind me, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with confusion. The creaking didn't make sense, but I had to admit, it was starting to make me feel uneasy. The next morning, I was in the hallway again when I noticed something strange by the door. A small patch of dirt had appeared, scattered just inside the threshold. It looked fresh, like it had been placed there deliberately overnight. I crouched down, touching it, and it felt soft and damp, as if it had been disturbed recently. I looked around, trying to figure out where the dirt had come from, but there was no logical explanation. The house was clean, and there was no sign of any outdoor dirt being tracked inside. I swept the dirt away with the dustpan, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my stomach. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just a coincidence. The dirt, the creaking, they all felt connected somehow, as if something was quietly unfolding within my house that I couldn't see. The creaking didn't stop. It grew more frequent, more pronounced. It seemed to follow a pattern. Around midnight, the floorboards outside my bedroom would creak once, then twice, and then a third time. Always in the same rhythm, as if something or someone was pacing in the hallway. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe the house was settling, or maybe the wind was causing the old wood to shift. But when the creaking began again the following night, it was accompanied by a fresh layer of dirt by the door. This time, there was more dirt, more than I had seen before. It seemed to have been deliberately spread out in a small pile. I knelt down again, touching the dirt with my fingers. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, and a wave of fear washed over me. The pattern was undeniable. The creaking wasn't just a sound, it was a signal. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew I had to find out what was happening. That night, I decided to stay up, determined to uncover the source of the creaking. I sat in the dark, listening to the house, waiting for the sound to begin. The hours dragged on, and I found myself growing more and more tense. The silence in the house felt heavy, like something was about to happen. At first, I heard nothing, but just as I was starting to wonder if I was imagining things, I heard it again. The familiar creak of the floorboards echoed through the hallway. I held my breath, waiting. There was no mistaking it. This time, the sound was coming from right outside my door. Quietly, I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept to the door and slowly opened it, hoping to catch whatever was causing the noise. What I found was even more unsettling than I had imagined. The hallway was empty, just like it had been before. But the air felt different, heavier, colder. The floorboards creaked again, this time from behind me. I spun around, heart racing. There was no one there, but the creaking continued, as if something was moving across the floor. I took a few steps back, feeling my way toward the door to the living room. That's when I saw it. The dirt. More than before, scattered in a small, deliberate pile near the entrance. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It didn't feel like a random occurrence anymore. The dirt and the creaking, they were connected. Part of something I couldn't see, something I didn't understand. I walked cautiously toward the door, my pulse quickening. As I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden icy chill run up my spine. The creaking stopped, and silence filled the house. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet that filled the air like a storm waiting to break. I opened the door slowly. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as I stepped into the living room, I noticed something even more disturbing. A thin layer of dirt had been tracked across the floor, as though someone had been walking around, dragging their feet through it. The dirt was fresh, just like the pile by the door, but there were no footprints leading to or from the mess. There was no sign of where it had come from, no sign of anyone. I closed the door behind me, my mind racing. None of this made sense. Who or what was leaving the dirt? Why was it always by the door? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I call someone? Should I leave the house? I had no answers, only more questions. The creaking didn't stop. It continued in the same spots, and the dirt kept appearing, sometimes in small piles, sometimes scattered in thin lines. No matter how much I tried to clean it up, it would return, as if the house itself was pushing it back into place. I began to wonder if there was something hidden beneath the floorboards, something I was never meant to discover. Maybe the house itself was hiding something old, something forgotten. The idea that the house had a life of its own, that it was alive in some strange way, began to take root in my mind. I couldn't bring myself to leave, but every night, as the creaking began again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was moving just out of sight, hidden in the shadows, watching me. And every time I cleaned the dirt away, I wondered if it would be the last time, or if the next pile would be even bigger, more insistent. The house was changing, and I was starting to wonder if I was the one who was out of place. Story 3. It was a Monday morning when I opened my email inbox. I was still feeling tired from the weekend and trying to shake off the sleepiness. As usual, I quickly scanned through the usual spam emails and newsletters I never signed up for. But then, one subject line caught my attention. Your day today. At first, it seemed like just another spam email, something vague and unimportant. But there was something about it that felt strange, almost like it was meant for me. Without thinking much, I clicked on it, half expecting to find another sales pitch or scam. The moment the email opened, I froze. This wasn't an ordinary email. It wasn't some marketing junk or a random advertisement. Instead, it was a detailed description of my entire day. But what made it so strange was that the email didn't just mention vague things. It listed exactly what I would do, where I would go, and even the specific times. At first, I thought it might just be a weird coincidence, but the more I read, the more I started to panic. The first line of the email read, "At 8 a.m., you will get up and go to the bathroom. You will wear the gray shirt you left on the chair yesterday, and you will brush your teeth for exactly 3 minutes. No more, no less." I was stunned. I had left that shirt on the chair the night before, and I usually brush my teeth for exactly 3 minutes. But how could anyone know that? How could they predict what I was going to do? The email kept going, describing each moment of my day in detail. By 9:15 a.m., it said I would leave my house to get coffee from the same cafe I always go to. It even knew what I would order. A large black coffee with 1 sugar, something I had never told anyone except my best friend. The email also described a conversation I would have with the barista, something I hadn't even thought about until I read it. How could anyone know this? Who was watching me? As I read on, the email got even more specific. It described when I would take my break at work, the exact route I would take on my walk at lunch, and even the small things I would say to my coworkers. It wasn't just general information. It felt like someone was watching me every second, knowing exactly what I was going to do before I did it. The email then predicted something that really freaked me out. At 4:30 p.m., I would receive a call from my sister. I hadn't spoken to her in days, and I didn't expect to hear from her that day. But as soon as I read that part of the email, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from her. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. How could this be happening? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the email wasn't just listing things that could happen. It was describing things that were already happening. It was as if someone knew what I was doing in real time, not just predicting the future. The sender's email address was just a random string of letters and numbers, untraceable and anonymous. I checked the email's header, but there was no clue about who sent it. No signature, no name, no explanation. As the day went on, the email's predictions kept coming true. It described a phone call I would make to my best friend at 7 p.m. I hadn't planned on calling her, but as soon as I read the email, I felt a strange urge to pick up the phone and dial her number. She answered right away, as if she had been expecting my call. "You okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I didn't know how to explain to her what was happening, so I just said, "Yeah, just checking in." It wasn't until I reached the final section of the email that I truly started to panic. It described my evening in painful detail. At 10 p.m., it said, "You will go to bed. You will set your alarm for 7 a.m. the next day. Your room will be dimly lit with your bedside lamp on its lowest setting. You will lie down feeling restless, unsure whether to fall asleep immediately or read for a few more minutes." I couldn't believe it. The email knew every little detail about me, even how I would feel before I fell asleep. I felt so exposed. How did this email know all these private details about me? Things I hadn't shared with anyone? Had someone been spying on me? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? I went over my day in my mind, trying to find any explanation for how someone could know so much. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the email wasn't just guessing what might happen. It was describing what had already happened. My entire day, step by step, had been laid out before me as if someone had been watching me all along, knowing my every move before I made it. I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the screen, trying to process what was happening. Then my phone buzzed again. It was a text from my sister. She had no idea what had happened, but her message made my heart sink. "You're not going to believe this," she wrote. "I just got a weird email too. It's about my day. Everything's spot on. I'm kind of freaked out. We need to talk." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. What was going on? How was this happening? Why were we both receiving these strange emails, predicting everything we did, down to the smallest detail? It didn't make any sense. I decided to reply to the email, hoping to get some answers. But when I hit reply, the address bounced back. The email was untraceable. There was no way to respond. The rest of the night was filled with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was controlling my actions. The email had predicted everything so perfectly, even the most personal details. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been watching me. watching us. I didn't know how or why, but I couldn't help but wonder. What else did they know about me? What was the purpose of these strange, intrusive predictions? And what would happen tomorrow? Would I wake up to another email detailing every step I would take? The thought made me question everything. Was my life still my own? Or was someone else pulling the strings? Story 4. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and I decided to take a walk and try a new coffee shop I had passed by several times. Each time I noticed the warm glow of the lights shining through the windows, and the cozy atmosphere seemed to pull people in. There wasn't any specific reason for choosing this place over the others. It just seemed so inviting. The moment I stepped inside, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The soft hum of quiet conversations and the sound of mugs clinking together created a comforting atmosphere. I stood in line, scanning the menu above the counter, trying to decide what I wanted. When it was my turn, the barista, a man who looked to be in his late 20s, with a short beard and a friendly smile, greeted me warmly. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" he asked. I smiled back, still trying to decide. I wasn't in the mood for anything too sweet, but I didn't want anything too bitter either. After a moment of thinking, I finally made up my mind. "I'll have a latte, please," I said, trying to sound confident in my order. The barista nodded and tapped my order into the register. As he worked, I glanced around the coffee shop. The place was charming, with mismatched chairs and bookshelves filled with old novels. Soft jazz music played in the background, making it feel like the perfect place to relax, enjoy a cup of coffee, and maybe catch up on some reading. I fished out my wallet to pay. As I did, I couldn't help but notice a group of people sitting by the window, deep in conversation. I hadn't expected the shop to be so busy, but it made the place feel even warmer. Once I paid and received my receipt, the barista called out, "Latte for my name." I looked up, confused. He had used my name, something I hadn't mentioned when I placed my order. I hadn't even told him my name. For a second, I wondered if I had accidentally told him my name while ordering, but I was sure I hadn't. I hadn't said anything beyond ordering a latte. Curious and slightly puzzled, I walked over to the counter where the barista had placed the coffee. He smiled and handed me the cup. "Here you go, latte for my name," he said again, as if he had been expecting me. I took the cup and looked at the name written on it. It was written in the usual coffee shop font, and it was my name. My mind raced. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him, and I certainly hadn't given any sign that I was a regular customer. How could he have known? I paused for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he had just guessed my name? Or maybe he had overheard someone else call me by name while I was in line. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was overthinking things. But still, I felt uneasy. I took the latte and found an empty seat near the back of the shop. I placed the coffee down in front of me and stared at it for a moment. The name was still written in black ink on the cup. It just didn't make sense. If I had told the barista my name when I ordered, I would have expected him to call out latte for my name only after I had told him what I wanted. But that hadn't happened. I took a sip of the latte, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It tasted just like a latte should, smooth and creamy, with a slight bitterness from the espresso. It was delicious, but the strange incident with my name still lingered in my mind. I glanced around the room again. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No one was paying me any special attention. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I had never been to this coffee shop before. Yet, the barista knew my name. What if I had been there before, but I simply didn't remember? That didn't make sense either. I had visited many coffee shops over the years, but I was certain that this one was new to me. I had never ordered coffee there before, and I certainly hadn't made any previous visits. It was almost as if someone had already placed an order in my name, and I was just picking it up without ever having asked for it. After a while, I couldn't sit still anymore. The sense of unease grew stronger. I stood up, preparing to leave. As I walked past the counter, I glanced back toward the barista. He was smiling at me again, his eyes twinkling, as if he knew something I didn't. I stopped in my tracks, wondering if I had imagined it. Had I just misheard him calling my name? But no, there it was again. The smile was too knowing, too comfortable. It felt like he had been expecting me all along. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about that smile made me feel even more unsettled. I walked out of the coffee shop, clutching the empty cup in my hand. As I stepped into the fresh air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been part of something strange, something I couldn't fully explain. The whole encounter felt like a dream, bizarre, confusing, and just a little bit off. I tried to rationalize it, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the nagging thought. How did the barista know my name? How had he written it on the cup before I ever told him? Later that evening, I found myself lying in bed, replaying the entire experience over and over again in my mind. It was just a coffee, I told myself. There's no harm in it. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Maybe it was nothing, a coincidence, a fluke. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if I had missed something. Maybe the barista had seen me before, or maybe someone had mentioned my name in passing. But none of it seemed to add up. The whole experience felt like something out of place, like I had stepped into a story I couldn't fully understand. As the days went on, I couldn't forget about the coffee shop. Every time I passed by, I felt an odd pull to go inside again and see if it happened once more. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The memory of the barista handing me the coffee with my name written on it lingered in my mind and it gnawed at me. I never went back to that coffee shop, but every now and then, I'd think about that latte I never ordered and the name written on the cup, as if I had already been expected there long before I stepped inside. Story 5. It started like a normal evening. I had just finished a long day at work, and after making a quick dinner, I settled on the couch to watch some television. My apartment is on the second floor, facing a quiet street. Usually, the only sounds I hear are the occasional passing cars. As I sat there, half listening to the show, I glanced out the window. My eyes froze when I saw something strange. There, just outside, was a man standing perfectly still in the yard below my apartment. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, or perhaps he was just walking by and had stopped to look at something. But then I realized something that made my heart stop. He was staring directly at my window, his face pressed slightly toward the glass. I felt a cold chill run through me, and my heart skipped a beat. I quickly looked away, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe he was just lost, or maybe he didn't realize I could see him from my apartment. But the feeling of unease stayed with me. I took a deep breath and cautiously peeked out again. To my horror, he was still there. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was just standing there, staring. I couldn't make out his features clearly because it was too dark, but I could see that he was wearing a dark jacket and a hat, which shadowed his face. Despite the darkness, his presence felt overpowering. I should have moved away from the window immediately, but something kept me frozen in place. It was either fear or sheer curiosity, I'm not sure, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. His gaze seemed to burn through the glass, even though I was several feet away. There was something off about the way he stood, so still, like he was waiting for something. It wasn't normal. Suddenly, I pulled the blinds down quickly, closing them tightly, and stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was a passerby who didn't realize I could see him from my apartment. I moved into the kitchen, trying to distract myself by washing dishes and tidying up, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying the image of the man in my head, wondering why he hadn't moved. The thought of someone standing out there, watching me, made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I had lived in this apartment for a while, and I had never felt unsafe before, but now everything seemed different. I was nervous and unsure of what to think. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to check again. I slowly pulled the blinds up, glancing nervously out at the yard. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the area was still quiet, but the man was gone. Just like that, he had disappeared. I scanned the yard, hoping to see him walking away or hiding behind a tree, but there was nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My heart raced as I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I had seen him standing there, staring at me. I double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The strange feeling lingered, but I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the man and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Every creak of the building seemed amplified. Every shadow outside my window seemed to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. The next day, I went about my usual routine, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the man outside my window. I found myself glancing outside more often, checking the yard and the street below. But there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. My mind began to convince me that I was just being overly cautious. Maybe it had been some strange fluke, a random occurrence that didn't mean anything. That night, however, the feeling returned. I had just settled in to watch a movie when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Once again, the man was standing outside my window. This time, he was even closer to the building than before, but still just out of range for me to see his details clearly. He was standing in the same motionless way, just staring. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe waiting for me to notice him again. I didn't dare to look away this time. I grabbed my phone and quietly took a photo of him through the window. But when I checked the photo, he wasn't there anymore. The photo was just of an empty yard, with the darkness swallowing any trace of the man. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My hand was shaking as I scrolled through the photo, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had disappeared the moment I tried to document it. I quickly closed the blinds and backed away from the window. My heart was hammering in my chest. Over the next few days, everything felt like a blur. I was filled with paranoia and dread. I had the feeling he was always nearby, always watching. I found myself double-checking the locks before going to bed and peering out the window far more than I should have. I even thought about installing security cameras around my apartment, but something held me back. What if I was just imagining it? What if nothing was really happening and I was just spiraling into fear? Then, one evening, as I was walking home from work, I noticed something chilling. I was passing my apartment building when I saw the man again. This time, he wasn't standing outside my window, but instead, he was walking down the street, heading away from the building. My stomach dropped when I saw him. I recognized him from the past few nights. He looked almost exactly like the figure I had seen from my window, but this time, I could see his face more clearly. His expression was blank, almost too calm for someone walking down the street at dusk. He didn't seem to notice me at all, but I knew it was him. I quickly turned the corner, my heart racing, as I tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I stayed inside, afraid to even approach the window. The thought of the man watching me, possibly from the shadows, made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if he was real or just a figment of my imagination, but the lingering sense of being observed was undeniable. I had no proof, no way to explain what had happened, but I couldn't let it go. I wasn't sure if I would ever know the truth about who he was, or why he seemed to appear only when I was alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was out there, watching me from the dark corners of the world. Story 6. The vacation had been perfect. I spent 10 days away, completely disconnected from my usual routine. I spent my time relaxing on the beach and exploring new places. I didn't think much about home while I was away, enjoying the freedom of not having to worry about anything. But when the plane finally touched down and I made my way back to my car, a strange feeling of unease began to settle inside me. There's something about returning to an empty house that always makes me uneasy. It's a subtle reminder that, after all, I am alone. I didn't think much of it as I drove back to my place. The streets were familiar, and the thought of being back in my own bed made me feel a little more at ease. When I pulled up to my house, everything seemed normal at first. The porch lights were on, just like I had left them. The yard was exactly how I remembered it. But as I walked up to the door, something felt off. It wasn't anything major at first, but I noticed immediately that the key I had hidden under the welcome mat was missing. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The small metal key I always kept under the mat, just in case I lost my real key, was gone. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I was certain I was the only person with a spare key. I hadn't given one to anyone else, and I certainly hadn't told anyone about the secret hiding spot under the mat. I knelt down to check again, but the key was definitely gone. My pulse quickened. I glanced up at the door, and that's when I saw something else. The door was slightly ajar. My mind raced. I couldn't remember leaving it open, not even a crack. I always made sure the door was fully locked before I left. I even double-checked it before leaving for vacation, just to be safe. With a shaky hand, I reached for the door handle. Thoughts were spinning in my head. Who had been inside my house? Could it be that someone actually used the key to get in? I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room. The silence in the house was unnerving. Everything looked the same, but there was something strange in the air, like someone had been there and quickly left. The living room was untouched. Nothing was out of place. I walked through the hallway, checking the kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedrooms. Everything seemed normal, but still, something felt off. There was a faint smell in the air, almost like someone had been cooking or just standing in the kitchen for a while. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. When I made my way into the bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bed was slightly messed up. I always made my bed in the morning before I left, but now the covers were rumpled, as though someone had been lying there. My stomach churned, and I felt the walls closing in around me. Who had been in my house while I was away? Why would they leave the door open and take the key? What did they want? I quickly checked my things, opening drawers and closets, but nothing seemed to be missing. All of my valuables were still where I had left them. Still, the feeling of being violated lingered in my stomach. Someone had been here, and they had gone through my things. How did they get in? I hadn't told anyone I was going on vacation, and no one knew about the key under the mat except me. My mind raced through every possibility. Could I have forgotten to lock the door when I left? Had someone broken in and then left after messing with my things? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. But the most disturbing part was the key. If someone had taken it, they knew exactly where to look. The thought that someone might have been watching me, even when I thought I was alone, was terrifying. I called my best friend and asked if they had noticed anything strange while I was gone. They hadn't. When I mentioned the missing key, they seemed just as unsettled as I was. I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the bed being disturbed. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I also didn't want to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. We talked for a while, but my mind kept going back to the house. After hanging up, I decided to check my security camera footage. I wanted to see if anything unusual had happened while I was away. I opened the app on my phone and watched the footage from the past few days. At first, the camera outside the front door didn't show anything unusual, but as I watched more closely, I saw something that made my heart stop. Late one evening, just a few days before I returned home, there was a shadow moving across the porch. The figure was wearing dark clothes, and it looked like they were crouching near the mat, right where I had hidden the key. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been there. I rewound the footage, heart racing, trying to get a better look. The figure walked up to the door, bent down, and spent a few moments by the mat before standing up and walking away. It was so quick, so discreet, that I almost missed it. My breath caught as I realized the significance of what I had seen. Whoever had been there had taken the key and entered the house. They had known exactly where to look. I immediately called the police and explained what had happened, showing them the footage. They seemed concerned and promised to send someone over to investigate. It didn't take long for them to arrive, and I showed them everything I had found. The missing key, the slightly open door, and the footage of the person near my porch. The police took the information seriously, but I could tell they were cautious, not wanting to alarm me unnecessarily. Still, I could see the worry in their eyes. This wasn't just a random break-in. It was something more deliberate. Someone had been planning this. The police checked for fingerprints and did a thorough sweep of the house, but they didn't find anything else that could indicate who had been there. They advised me to change the locks and take extra precautions, which I did immediately. But no matter how many locks I changed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though whoever had done this was still out there, still knowing things about me that I hadn't shared with anyone. In the days that followed, I tried to go about my life as usual, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I was being followed, that someone was keeping tabs on me. Every time I went outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I was being watched. I couldn't relax or feel safe in my own home. Even the smallest noises, like the creak of the floorboards or the rustling of the trees outside, set me on edge. I thought about installing more cameras, setting up an alarm system, and doing everything I could to protect myself. But deep down, I knew that the real problem wasn't the security of my house. It was the knowledge that someone had been inside, had taken something as simple as my spare key, and was now out there, lurking in the shadows. I didn't know who they were, but I knew one thing for sure. My life had changed. I would never feel safe again. Story 7. I had just gotten home from a long, tiring day at work. I was exhausted and ready to relax. The house was quiet, just like usual, and everything seemed perfectly normal. After dropping my things at the door, I decided to go straight to the bathroom to wash my face. I opened the door, flicked on the light, and paused. What I saw made me freeze. On the fogged-up mirror was my name, written in neat, clear letter. My first reaction was disbelief. How could this be? I hadn't turned on the shower, and the mirror wasn't steamed up when I entered the room. I stood there for a moment, staring at the fog on the glass. My full name was written clearly as day. It wasn't just a smear or random pattern. It was intentional. Someone had written it, but I was alone in the house. I hadn't been in the bathroom long enough for the mirror to fog up, and I certainly hadn't turned on the shower or the bath. The more I looked at it, the more I felt a chill creeping up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my mind raced to find an explanation. Maybe there was a logical reason for this, something I hadn't noticed, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wiped my hand across the mirror, watching the condensation disappear with the touch of my fingers, leaving behind nothing but the clean surface of the glass. The fog was gone, but the uneasy feeling remained. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to understand how it could have happened. Could it have been condensation from the bathroom? Maybe a bit of fog from the room's humidity? But why would it form into the perfect shape of my name? And more importantly, how did it happen when I was the only one in the house? I thought back to the morning, the last time I had used the bathroom. I didn't remember leaving the mirror fogged up when I left, but that was hours ago. Could I have overlooked something like that? I checked the rest of the bathroom for any clues. Everything was exactly where I left it. Nothing unusual, no signs that anyone had been here. The room was exactly as it should be. Still, the image of my name written on the mirror haunted me. It felt like someone had been in here, someone who knew exactly who I was. But there was no one in the house. I was completely alone. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, trying to brush off the strange experience, but the feeling of being watched never left me. As night fell, and I settled into bed, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I had to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror and how the fog had formed those perfect letters. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a strange coincidence. But the fact that it happened when I wasn't expecting it made it seem too unusual to ignore. The mirror had been so clear when I first entered the bathroom. It couldn't have just been a mistake. The next day I tried to forget about the whole thing. I didn't want to dwell on the oddity of the situation, but every time I walked into the bathroom, I couldn't help but look at the mirror, half expecting the same thing to happen again. But nothing did. The fog never returned, and the mirror stayed clear. However, the unease lingered. I couldn't stop wondering who, if anyone, had been in my apartment. I checked all the doors and windows and they were locked, just like usual. It didn't make sense. Who else could have been here? And who would have written my name in the fog? Days went by, and I tried to put the incident behind me. I told myself it was just a bizarre occurrence, maybe some kind of natural phenomenon I couldn't explain. But there was a thought that wouldn't leave my mind. The whole situation seemed far too deliberate. It wasn't just a random condensation pattern. It was my name, clearly written, like someone wanted me to see it. I couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering if it was some kind of message, if someone was trying to tell me something. Then, about a week later, it happened again. I had just gotten home from work, feeling the same exhaustion I had the previous days. I went straight to the bathroom, hoping to freshen up. But as soon as I opened the door, I froze. There it was again. My name. This time even clearer, more deliberate. Someone had written it in the fog on the bathroom mirror. But this time, it wasn't just my name. There was a short message beneath it. I'm watching. My heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this was making his presence known. I quickly wiped the fog off the mirror, but the words and my name stayed burned into my mind. It felt as if someone was trying to tell me something, trying to get my attention. I rushed out of the bathroom, checking every corner of my apartment, but there was no one. The doors were locked, the windows shut. Everything was just as it had been when I left. But the feeling of being watched had never been more intense. I tried to reach out to friends, asking if they had ever experienced anything like this. No one had. I looked up stories online, trying to find some kind of explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. Some people suggested it could be a prank or a practical joke, but it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like something that could just be explained away. The message wasn't a random joke. It felt personal. It felt deliberate. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking just outside my vision, watching me from the shadows. The message on the mirror made it clear that whoever was doing this knew where I lived, knew my name, and was somehow able to get into my apartment without me knowing. The thought of it kept me up at night. And even though I tried to reassure myself that it was just some kind of prank or mistake, deep down, I knew it wasn't. I began locking the bathroom door when I wasn't in there. I set up extra security measures in my apartment. I had to protect myself, but the thought of someone I didn't know, being in my space, writing on my mirror, made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I stepped into the bathroom, I half expected to see my name again, written in the fog, but it never came. The mirror stayed clean. I still don't know who did it, or why. It's been weeks, and I haven't seen anything else like it, but the feeling hasn't gone away. Someone knows my name. Someone has been in my bathroom when I wasn't home, and they're still out there somewhere, waiting. Story 8. It was a typical Tuesday when I noticed something strange. I was going through some paperwork in my home office, trying to organize things that I had been meaning to deal with for weeks. The room was cluttered with old receipts, unopened letters, and files I hadn't touched in months. As I sifted through the stack of papers on my desk, something caught my eye. It was a folder tucked in between two piles of other documents. It had my name on it, in bold black letters. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. I had no memory of ever creating or even seeing this folder before. I was curious, so I opened it. Inside, I found a file that seemed to go on forever. It was thick with pages, all neatly organized in chronological order. I could barely breathe as I flipped through the first few sheets. What I found was unsettling. Every phone conversation I had over the past year was transcribed in precise detail. The transcripts weren't just from important calls or moments I remembered. They included even the most mundane exchanges, the briefest conversations. There were conversations with friends, colleagues, and family, but also calls I had made to order takeout, or the ones I had with the cashier at a store. Every single word was there, written down as if someone had been recording every conversation I'd had, without me knowing. My hands began to shake as I flipped through the pages. I read bits and pieces of conversations I didn't even remember having. I found my own voice captured in precise detail, recounting stories to my best friend, discussing work with my boss, even arguing with my neighbor about a parking spot. Each conversation was time-stamped, down to the exact second I made or received the call. There were no gaps, no missing conversations. The thought that someone had been listening to every single word I said, every phone call I had made my stomach churn. The invasion of my privacy was beyond anything I could comprehend. I immediately started thinking about the obvious questions. Who could have done this? And how did they gain access to my phone? I had no idea. I hadn't noticed anything unusual with my phone. There was no strange behavior, no unfamiliar apps running, Nothing seemed out of place. I went through my recent phone bills, looking for any suspicious charges, but there was nothing. No signs of hacking, no unauthorized access, or any calls listed that didn't belong. It was as if the conversations had been transcribed from somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't trace. How was this even possible? I continued flipping through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The file didn't just contain calls I made on my personal phone. It also included conversations I'd had on my work phone, calls I'd made during meetings, and even conversations I thought were private. There were times when I had discussed personal issues or shared things I hadn't wanted anyone else to know. The realization that someone I didn't know, had been privy to all of this made my skin crawl. The thought that I had no control over it, that this person had been silently recording every word I said, made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a glitch, some sort of mistake or technical error. Perhaps a program had mistakenly recorded the calls and compiled them. But as I kept looking through the file, I saw that it was too thorough to be an accident. The way the conversations were transcribed was meticulous, with no errors or missed details. Whoever had done this had been paying very close attention. It felt deliberate. It felt calculated. The more I read, the more the weight of what was happening began to sink in. I was being watched, recorded, and I had no idea who was behind it. I started to feel paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, even now as I sat alone in my office. I kept thinking about the smallest details, the things I had said in passing, the times I had been vulnerable or upset, the moments I thought no one was listening. But someone had been listening, and now they had this file to prove it. I was terrified. My first instinct was to destroy the file, to burn it, tear it up, and get rid of the evidence that this invasion had ever happened. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that destroying it wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo what had already been done. And what if there was more? What if this file was just the tip of the iceberg? I didn't know what to do next. I felt like I was trapped in some nightmare, unable to escape. Every time I looked at the file, I felt more helpless. I needed answers, but the only thing I knew for sure was that I was no longer in control of my own life. This was something bigger, something I couldn't fix on my own. Who was behind this? Why was I being targeted? I couldn't stop asking myself these questions, but no matter how many times I tried to answer them, I was left with more fear than understanding. I debated whether I should go to the authorities. It seemed extreme, but what else could I do? How could I explain what I had found without sounding crazy? Who would believe me if I told them that someone had been listening to every phone call I made and compiling detailed transcripts of them? Then I remembered the smallest details in the file, things I had said that weren't just random. There were conversations about my family, my routines, my habits, things that only someone close to me would know. The idea that someone I knew, someone I trusted, could be involved in this made me sick to my stomach. I decided to confront the people closest to me, hoping to find some kind of explanation. But as I spoke to my friends and family, I realized that no one knew anything. No one seemed to have any clue about what had been happening. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard anything strange. They all looked at me like I was crazy when I mentioned the file. Was I losing my mind, or was I really being watched? I spent the next few days in a constant state of fear and paranoia. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time my phone rang, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Every time I made a call, I wondered if it was being recorded, if my words were being stored somewhere, transcribed into a file that I couldn't see. The worst part was that I felt completely powerless. Whoever had done this had been so meticulous, so thorough, that I couldn't figure out how to stop it. I had no way of knowing how long it had been happening or if it was still going on. The file remained in my possession, a constant reminder of the invasion of my privacy. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I also couldn't stop thinking about the danger it posed. It wasn't just about the file. It was about the fact that someone, somewhere, had been following my every move. And now, with no explanation, I was left to wonder who it was and what they wanted from me. The file was just the beginning, and the fear of what might come next haunted me every day. Story 9. It was a normal morning when I arrived at work, still feeling a bit sleepy. I stepped into my office, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space. I placed my bag on the desk, ready to start the day. It seemed like any other day, full of emails to answer, meetings to attend, and projects to complete. But as I sat down and started organizing my papers, something caught my eye. On the edge of my desk, there was a business card lying face up. I frowned, wondering if I had accidentally received it from a colleague the day before and simply forgotten about it. I picked it up, and as I turned it over, a knot formed in my stomach. The name and phone number printed on the card were completely unfamiliar to me. The card was simple, with a black and white design, professional and neat, but something about it didn't feel right. The words on the card were clear. "We've met before." Beneath that statement was a name that meant nothing to me. I didn't recognize it at all. The phone number listed was also not connected to anyone in my life. I turned the card over and over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The more I looked at it, the more confused I became. Who would leave a card with such a strange message, and why? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the business card as my mind raced. The phrase "we've met before" felt personal, yet distant. I had no recollection of ever meeting anyone with that name, nor could I think of any situation in my life where I would have. It wasn't the kind of card you just find lying around, and the words seemed too deliberate to be a mistake. There had to be a reason it was placed there, but no matter how hard I tried, the explanation eluded me. I spent the next few minutes checking my phone, wondering if the name might be a contact I had messaged recently. I searched through my recent calls and texts, but nothing matched the name on the card. The knot in my stomach grew tighter. Why would someone leave this for me? The message felt like it was meant specifically for me, not just some random card left by mistake. There was something deeply unsettling about the entire situation. I decided to reach out to my colleagues, hoping that one of them might recognize the name or remember some context in which I might have met this person. I texted a few of them, asking if they had seen anything strange on my desk or if they knew who the business card might belong to, but no one had any answers. They all assured me that it wasn't theirs and that they hadn't left anything on my desk. My mind started to race again, thinking about other possibilities. Could it be a prank? Maybe someone was trying to mess with me or confuse me for some reason, but it didn't seem like a prank. The business card looked too professionally made, and the message was too precise. It didn't feel like the kind of joke someone would play. It felt more deliberate, more ominous. The uncertainty lingered in my mind throughout the day. By the time lunchtime arrived, I could no longer ignore the unease growing in my chest. I considered calling the number on the card, but something stopped me. What if it was a mistake? Or worse, what if it wasn't a mistake? What if the person on the other end knew something I didn't? I felt paralyzed by the unknown. My fingers hovered over the phone, and for a long moment, I didn't know what to do. Instead of calling, I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a mix-up, and the card had been left on my desk by accident. But then I remembered the message. We've met before. That wasn't random. It felt intentional, like I was supposed to recognize the name, like there was some connection I was supposed to make. But I couldn't. I couldn't place the name, and I couldn't remember ever meeting anyone who would leave such a message. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but the card kept pulling my attention back. Each time I looked at it, I found myself searching for any hint, any clue that could make sense of the situation. I even Googled the name on the card, but nothing useful came up. The search yielded nothing, only more confusion. Whoever had left the card had covered their tracks well, leaving no traces behind. When I left the office that evening, the card was still on my desk, waiting for me to figure it out. I debated whether to take it home with me or leave it there. But in the end, I slipped it into my pocket. The strange encounter felt too important to leave behind, too unsettling to forget. As I drove home, the words on the card echoed in my mind. We've met before. I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something, but I just couldn't figure out what. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over. The card haunted me, its simple words lingering in my thoughts. I tried to think back, trying to recall any moment in my life when I might have met someone with that name, but nothing came to mind. I even wondered if it was connected to something from my past, some forgotten memory or interaction that had slipped through the cracks, but still, nothing made sense. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out who had left the card and why. The sense of foreboding that came with the message made me feel like I was missing something important. I couldn't let it go, not without some kind of resolution. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. As I walked into the office that morning, I was determined to find out what was going on. The card had stayed in my pocket overnight, and it was now in my hand again as I approached my desk. But when I arrived, I froze. The card was no longer there. My desk was just as it had been when I left the night before. Papers neatly stacked, computer turned off, but the card was gone. I looked around the office, hoping to see any hint of where it might have gone, but there was no sign of anyone acting suspiciously. I checked with my colleagues again, but no one had seen anything. The card, the mysterious message, and the name I couldn't place had all disappeared without a trace. My mind reeled with confusion. It was as if the card had never been there in the first place, as if it had never existed at all. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something had shifted. The office felt different, colder, as if a presence was lingering just beyond my reach. The disappearance of the card only deepened the mystery. I had no explanation for it, and the more I tried to understand what had happened, the less sense it all made. It was as if someone had wanted me to feel lost, to question everything I thought I knew. Weeks passed, and the incident faded into the background of my everyday life. But every now and then, I would find myself glancing at my desk, half expecting to see that business card reappear. Each time I thought about it, the feeling of unease would creep back. Who had left it? Why had I met someone before, as the card suggested? Or was it a warning, a message I couldn't understand? The question still lingered, unanswered, floating in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. Story 10. It was a quiet evening when my landlord called. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across my small apartment. I was curled up on the couch, enjoying a good book and the peacefulness of the evening. The phone rang, breaking the silence. I looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. I picked up the phone, expecting a routine call. My landlord's voice came through on the other end, but instead of the usual small talk about rent or maintenance issues, he went straight to the point. "Hey, "I noticed your water usage has doubled this month," he said, sounding a bit worried. "Do you have someone staying with you?" I was taken aback. "What? No, I'm living alone," I replied, feeling confused. I hadn't had anyone over, and I hadn't used an unusually high amount of water. It didn't make sense. I could feel a slight unease creeping in as I processed his words. My landlord, who was usually pretty relaxed, seemed genuinely concerned about the spike in water usage. It almost felt like he thought I was hiding something. "Are you sure? The numbers show a clear increase," he pressed, sounding insistent but not accusing. "Maybe someone is using the water when you're not around." His suggestion felt off. I had been home most of the time, working from my apartment and rarely leaving for extended periods. No one had been there. No guests, no friends visiting. I assured him again that I was alone, but his voice still sounded doubtful. "Well, I'm just concerned," he said, before abruptly ending the conversation. The moment the call ended, I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the screen in disbelief. How could my water usage have doubled if no one else was in the apartment? The question lingered in my mind as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, trying to make sense of it. I knew I hadn't used more water than usual. In fact, I was always careful with things like that, turning off the tap when I wasn't using it, taking shorter showers, not leaving the faucet running unnecessarily. Nothing about my routine had changed. The idea that someone had been secretly using my water felt absurd. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I had lived in this apartment for nearly a year, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Sure, my landlord had raised concerns occasionally about the upkeep of the building, but this was different. Why would my water usage suddenly spike? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe there was a mistake with the billing system, or a simple misunderstanding. Perhaps there was a technical glitch, or maybe the meter had been misread. I didn't want to jump to conclusions without more evidence, but the question of how it happened kept nagging at me. I spent the rest of the evening distracted. My mind was racing with possibility. Could someone have been sneaking into my apartment without me knowing? The thought was unsettling. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I considered the possibility that maybe there had been a small leak somewhere that I hadn't noticed, but even then, the increase in water usage didn't seem to make sense. A leak would waste water, but not to that extent, not without leaving some trace behind. I dismissed that theory and tried to relax. The next morning, I decided to check the apartment myself, just to be sure. I went over every corner, inspecting the plumbing fixtures and the water lines, but everything seemed fine. No signs of leaks or drips. I even checked the pipes beneath the sink, thinking maybe there was a hidden issue that I had missed, but everything appeared normal. As I stood there, staring at the pipes, the absurdity of the situation started to dawn on me. There was no way anyone had been sneaking in and using my water. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. I decided to call my landlord back, hoping for some clarity. When he answered, I tried to keep my voice calm, though I couldn't shake the anxiety that had settled in. "I checked the apartment," I said. "Everything is fine. There's no one here using the water, and I haven't noticed any leaks." My landlord was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "I don't know what to tell you," he said. "The numbers don't lie. You need to figure this out." His response didn't reassure me. It only made me feel like I was going in circles. I couldn't explain what had happened. It was just me in the apartment. No one else. No guests. No family visiting. The spike in water usage didn't make sense. The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel a sense of dread. There had to be an explanation, but I couldn't figure it out. I hung up the phone, promising to check again and let him know if I found anything new, but I wasn't sure where to start. Days passed, and the mystery of the water usage continued to linger in my mind. Every time I turned on the faucet, I couldn't help but wonder if the increase had somehow been tied to something I had missed. I began to track my water usage more carefully, keeping a mental note of every shower, every time I washed dishes or filled the kettle. But the numbers still didn't add up. I hadn't changed any of my habits. Nothing was different. So why was my water usage so high? At the end of the week, my landlord called again. This time, his tone was more serious, and I could tell he was frustrated. I had the water meter checked, he said. It looks like it's working fine. There's no problem with the system. His words only deepened my confusion. If the meter was fine, then why was there a sudden increase in water usage? What was going on? The idea that something had malfunctioned in the system no longer seemed likely. It felt like something else was at play, something I couldn't quite figure out. The thought that someone might have access to my apartment, perhaps without my knowledge, started to settle in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of someone sneaking in while I was at work, using my water without leaving a trace, but that seemed unlikely. I had checked everything, my locks, my windows, and nothing seemed out of place. Still, the more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. What if there was something I was missing? What if there was a hidden access point I hadn't noticed? Eventually, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed a security camera at the front door, hoping to catch any signs of someone entering when I wasn't around. I also checked the water meter myself, taking notes and comparing the readings over time. For days, nothing unusual happened. The camera didn't catch anything out of the ordinary, and the meter readings remained consistent with my usage. It seemed like things were going back to normal. But then, about a week later, I received another call from my landlord. His voice was tinged with confusion. "The water usage is up again," he said. "Is something less concerned this time?" More puzzled. "It doesn't make any sense. Have you noticed anything different?" I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as I processed his words. This couldn't be happening again. What was going on? Was the meter faulty? Was there some other explanation? I didn't know what to say anymore. All I could do was assure him that I was still living alone and that nothing had changed. But deep down, I began to feel like I was living in a situation that didn't have an answer. The mystery of the water usage spike was something I couldn't shake. I started to feel as though I was losing control of the situation, unable to explain what was happening in my own apartment. It was a strange feeling, like being watched, or like something was slipping just out of reach. The feeling of unease lingered, and though I tried to go about my life as usual, I couldn't escape the nagging question. Why had the water usage doubled, and why couldn't I find any answers?